Okay, so ready to dive deep into some seriously heavy philosophical waters? Today we're taking on John Rawls.
Yeah, Rawls, the big name in 20th century liberal political thought.
We're talking foundational stuff here, like what makes a just society? What's the point of political philosophy even?
And we've got our trusty guide, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. We'll be breaking down those dense ideas into something, digestible.
Yeah, and especially for you, our philosophically minded listener, we'll be getting into the nitty-gritty, the logic, the arguments, all that good stuff.
Exactly. We'll unpack those carefully crafted theories, those thought experiments, and see how Rawls built this whole philosophical structure.
And to help us map out this complex terrain, we have an actual expert, someone who can shed light on the nuances and the impact of Rawls' thinking. All right, so let's start with the man himself, John Rawls, born in Baltimore in 1921. Interesting family dynamic. His father, a big shot lawyer, his mother, active in the League of Women Voters. So, civic engagement was in the air.
It's like the seeds of political philosophy were already planted. And then, academically, he thrived. Princeton, Cornell. That's where he encountered Wittgenstein's ideas through his student, Norman Malcolm.
Oh, wow. So already in those formative years, engaging with some of the giants of philosophy.
Yeah. But then Oxford. And there, he really rubbed shoulders with some major figures. H.L.A. Hart, Isaiah Berlin, Stuart Hampshire, the intellectual heavyweights. And
Mhm.
finally, landing at Harvard for over 30 years, shaping minds.
Life in academia, but not one detached from the real world.
Absolutely not. Like, think about this. Rawls started out considering the priesthood. He even wrote a theology thesis, but then World War II happened. He served as an infantryman, saw firsthand the horrors of the Holocaust.
That must have been a turning point.
Absolutely a crisis of faith. It led him to grapple with the very nature of good and evil, justice and injustice. And later, his opposition to the Vietnam War draft, seeing it as profoundly unjust.
Those experiences, I can see how they seeped into his work.
It's like those monumental events became the foundation of his philosophical explorations. And you see it in his writings. We're talking about huge works. A Theory of Justice, a real game changer in 1971, followed by Political Liberalism, then The Law of Peoples, and finally, Justice as Fairness.
And it's that last one, right, that really sums up his thinking.
Yeah, Justice as Fairness, a restatement from 2001.
Hmm.
That's our focus for this deep dive. His most refined, his clearest articulation of his views.
All right, so we've got the man, we've got the times. Let's talk about his approach to political philosophy. Like, what was he trying to do with it?
So the encyclopedia outlines 4 key roles that Rawls saw for political philosophy. And the first one, the practical role. It's about finding common ground, right? Especially in times of serious political division.
Okay, yeah, so not just some ivory tower theorizing. He wanted it to be relevant to the real world, to the struggles societies face.
Totally. Think of Hobbes trying to make sense of chaos during the English Civil War or, the debates surrounding the U.S. Constitution. Slavery.
So philosophy is a tool to solve real problems.
Exactly. It can offer principles, guidelines for societies to, function, to hold together. And the examples Rawls gives, they highlight that urgency, that need for philosophy to engage with those real-world struggles.
So that's the practical role. What about the second one?
The orienting role. And this one's about helping people understand their place in society. Especially in a democracy where everyone's supposed to be equal, an equal citizen. It's about understanding what that actually means, what comes with that status.
So it's like a framework for figuring out, okay, what are my rights? What are my responsibilities?
Right. It's about shared identity, too, within this diverse community. What does it mean to be part of this whole? And for Rawls, political philosophy offered this unifying story where people, even with different beliefs, can see themselves as part of something bigger.
I like that, a unifying story.
Mhm.
Okay, so there's 2 roles. What's the third?
It's about pushing the boundaries, probing the limits of what's possible politically.
Ah, okay, so getting a little more idealistic.
In a way, yeah. But it's not just about daydreaming. It's a balance, right? You have to be grounded enough to propose solutions that could actually work, that people would get behind. But at the same time, there's that utopian dimension, this vision of the best possible society, the most just.
Laws as they might be, given humans as they are.
Yeah, that's how the encyclopedia puts it. And for us, thinking philosophically, that's where it gets exciting. It's not just describing what is, it's imagining what could be, stretching our political imaginations, while still acknowledging that we're dealing with real people, real limitations.
Okay, so we've explored the practical, the orienting, the boundary pushing. What's the fourth role of political philosophy for Rawls?
The fourth role is reconciliation. And this one might seem a little unexpected.
Reconciliation. How so?
It's about that frustration we sometimes feel with society, right? With all its imperfections, its injustices. Political philosophy, Rawls argues, can help alleviate that frustration by showing us that even in those imperfect developments, there's a kind of logic or rationality.
Interesting. So it's not just about change, it's also about understanding and maybe even accepting where we are.
In a way, yeah. It's like seeing the bigger picture, the historical forces, the reasons why things are the way they are, and that can bring a certain peace of mind.
Now, as for Rawls himself, his focus was on this tension, this constant tug of war between liberty and equality. Those core values of democratic thought.
Yeah, and how to square them, how to define the boundaries of toleration. How far does our acceptance of different beliefs, different ways of life actually go, both within a society and between societies?
And for him, it all boils down to this. How can a democratic society be both free and fair? And how can that kind of just society contribute to a more peaceful world?
And for you, with your philosophical background, you can appreciate the scope of that project. It's a monumental task, attempting to bring these core ideals together. Not choosing one over the other, but finding a way for them to coexist, to strengthen each other within this grand framework of justice.
So Rawls had these big ideas, but he also had a very specific way of approaching them. The encyclopedia talks about this sequence of theories, and it's different from like utilitarianism, right? Where you have one rule and you apply it everywhere.
Right. Utilitarianism, it's all about maximizing happiness, right? The greatest good for the greatest number. But Rawls, he said, hold on. The principles we use, they should depend on what we're talking about.
Okay, yeah. So different rules for different games.
Exactly. He recognized that, like, the way you make ethical choices as an individual, it might not be the same as the principles that should govern a whole society or the relationships between nations. This is a key takeaway for any philosopher. Rawls' philosophy is domain-specific. It's about recognizing the context, applying the right tools for the job.
So it's more nuanced, more sensitive to the specific issues at hand.
Exactly. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach to morality and politics. And his method, it was very deliberate. First, figure out the principles for a self-contained democratic society. That's the bedrock.
Right. Get that right, and then move on to the bigger picture.
Exactly. And in The Law of Peoples, he expands it to the international level. And he even hints at further extensions, like, what about our moral obligations to animals? So you see this layered approach, this meticulous building up from the ground level.
Systematically tackling different spheres of interaction.
Precisely. Each with its own set of complexities, its own challenges.
And within each of these levels, Rawls makes this key distinction between what's called ideal theory and non-ideal theory.
Yeah, that's a fundamental part of his approach. So ideal theory, it operates under, let's say, optimal conditions. It assumes that everyone's playing by the rules, the principles of justice, and that society has the resources, no extreme scarcity, no wars or major conflicts, basic needs are met.
Okay, so it's kind of like a best-case scenario.
In a way, yeah. And for someone looking at the messy realities of politics, it might seem a little, detached from reality. But it has a purpose. It lets you create this blueprint for a just society. You're setting the standard, the ultimate goal to aim for.
The perfect model, so to speak.
Exactly. And then non-ideal theory comes in. That's where you deal with the real world problems, the crime, the wars, the poverty.
So it's like, okay, we have this ideal, this vision. Now how do we deal with the messiness of the actual world?
Right. And Rawls argued that to fix those real-world problems, you need to know what the ideal is. That ideal, it gives you the framework, the direction. You can't fix what you don't understand, right?
Makes sense. So first the ideal, then you tackle the non-ideal.
Exactly. It's not utopian dreaming. It's about laying the groundwork for effective action.
Another key part of Rawls' methodology is this idea of reflective equilibrium. I mean, as a philosopher, this must resonate with you. It's about trying to make all your beliefs, all those moral and political ideas, fit together.
It's a beautiful concept, isn't it? Like a finely tuned system where everything from those gut feelings about right and wrong to those big abstract theories, they all align, they all make sense together. It's intellectual coherence, taking those deeply held beliefs and seeing if they hold up when you zoom out, when you look at the bigger picture.
And the process, it starts with what Rawls calls considered moral judgments. Those core beliefs that you've really thought about, that have stood up to scrutiny, they're your starting point.
But they're not set in stone, right? As you go through this process, you refine those judgments, maybe tweak the principles you're working with, even reevaluate those big theories of justice, and you keep going back and forth, adjusting until it all clicks into place. It's a constant process of fine-tuning.
And that initial stage, that's what Rawls calls narrow reflective equilibrium.
Right. But then he goes further with wide reflective equilibrium. And this is where it gets really interesting, especially for philosophers who appreciate the grand sweep of intellectual history.
So it's not just about your own beliefs. It's about engaging with all those different perspectives out there.
Exactly. It's like testing your ideas against the greats, looking at the history of political thought, at all those competing theories. And through that engagement, through that dialogue, you refine your own views. You make them stronger.
And this whole emphasis on finding coherence, it's a real departure from foundationalism, right? That idea that some beliefs are just, unshakable, the bedrock.
Yeah, for Rawls, it's all about the system, the web of beliefs, and no belief is sacred. If it doesn't fit, if it throws off the balance, you're willing to question it, to revise it.
So it's a very dynamic process, this pursuit of reflective equilibrium.
It is, yeah. It's a journey, a constant striving for that beautiful state of intellectual harmony.
Well, one last point about Rawls' methodology. He argues for the independence of moral and political theory. Now, this might seem a little counterintuitive. I mean, shouldn't our moral and political beliefs be grounded in, our understanding of reality, of knowledge, those big metaphysical and epistemological questions?
It's a really interesting point, and one that kind of flips the traditional script, especially for philosophers who tend to see things in a hierarchical way. Like, first you figure out the nature of reality, then how we know things, and then you can start talking about right and wrong, about how society should be organized.
So it's like, do we need to solve all the big philosophical mysteries before we can even talk about justice?
Right. But Rawls, he says, not necessarily. He acknowledged that any belief, in theory, could have some implications for our moral and political views. But he argued that, practically speaking, we can make real progress in thinking about ethics and politics without having to delve into the depths of metaphysics and epistemology.
Okay, so not completely ignoring those areas, but not letting them hold you back either.
Right. And he even suggests that maybe it's the other way around. Maybe by figuring out these principles of justice, by understanding how a just society should work, we can actually gain insights into those bigger philosophical questions. Like maybe the study of ethics, the study of politics, can inform our understanding of reality, of knowledge.
So it's a back and forth, a kind of reciprocal relationship.
Precisely. And that's a very Rawlsian move, right? Always looking for connections, for that beautiful harmony between different areas of thought.
All right, now let's jump into the heart of it. Political liberalism. And the big question here is, how do you create a just and stable society when everyone has such different beliefs? Different religions, different moral values, different philosophies of life.
Yeah, and that's the challenge Rawls takes head on. In a modern, free society, you're going to have this diversity of what he calls comprehensive doctrines. You can't escape it. But you still need some kind of shared framework, some common ground. And that's where political liberalism comes in.
Okay, so it's about navigating this pluralism, figuring out how people can live together under one set of laws, even if they disagree on fundamental things.
Exactly. And Rawls identifies two key problems here. First, legitimacy. Can you justify the use of political power, of coercion, when people have these fundamental disagreements? And second, stability. How do you get people with different worldviews to actually accept and abide by the same system?
So before we even talk about what a just society looks like, we need to figure out if it's even possible to have a shared political life in the face of this diversity.
Precisely. And that's the groundwork that political liberalism lays. It's the foundation for a just society, a society that can actually hold together. It's about those basic rules of the game, the rules that make it possible for us to live together, to make decisions together, even with all our differences.
It's important to note that political liberalism, it's not the same as Rawls' theory of justice, right? That's justice is fairness.
Yeah, justice is fairness is the main course, but political liberalism, it's the appetizer. It's what gets you ready for the main event. It's about setting the stage, creating the conditions where justice can actually flourish.
So first, you need a legitimate system, right? One where everyone feels like their voice is heard, that the rules are fair.
Exactly. And that brings us to Rawls' liberal principle of legitimacy. He argued that the use of political power is only justified when it's based on a constitution that everyone, all free and equal citizens, can reasonably get behind.
So not just majority rule, but something deeper than that.
Yeah, it has to be something that everyone can see as fair, as justifiable. Even if they disagree with some of the details, the core principles have to make sense to everyone. It has to be based on reasons that everyone can accept. And that's where the idea of reciprocity comes in.
Reciprocity. Okay, so it's about, like, a give and take.
In a way, yeah, it's like I can accept this system, these laws, because I have reason to believe that you, even with your different beliefs, can also accept them. It's a shared understanding, a mutual recognition that the rules are fair.
And that gets us to the question of, what does it even mean to be a reasonable citizen in this context?
Right. So for Rawls, a reasonable citizen, they want to live in a society where cooperation is possible, right? They're willing to work with others, to compromise, to find those common rules.
And they're not just going to try to force their own views on everyone else.
Exactly. They recognize that other people have different, comprehensive doctrines, different fundamental beliefs about life, about morality, about religion. And even if they're deeply convinced of their own views, they respect the right of others to hold different beliefs.
So it's about tolerance, about respecting those differences.
And it's not just about being nice, right? It's about recognizing the limits of our own knowledge, the burdens of judgment, as Rawls calls them. We all have different experiences. We interpret evidence in different ways. There's so much complexity in the world.
So it's not surprising that people come to different conclusions.
Exactly. And that's why reasonable citizens, they don't try to impose their whole worldview on everyone else. They understand that diversity of belief is it's a part of living in a free society.
Okay, so there's this acceptance of pluralism. But is Rawls just hoping for the best here? Like, hoping that all these different comprehensive doctrines will just magically align on these fundamental principles?
Well, he does talk about reasonable pluralism, this idea that over time, those different worldviews will, converge on a shared commitment to democratic values. It's a hopeful vision.
But it's not just blind faith.
No. Rawls acknowledges that this is a work in progress. And that brings us to the question of, if we can't base political legitimacy on any one comprehensive doctrine, where do we find that common ground?
Right. If you can't use religion or any particular philosophy, what do you use?
Rawls says, look to the public political culture. It's like the shared DNA of a democratic society.
A public political culture. Okay, so what does that include?
Think of it as like the operating system. It's the institutions, the constitution, the legal system. It's the way we interpret those institutions, the role of the courts, for example. And it's also those historically significant texts, those documents, those speeches that have shaped our understanding of what this country is about.
Okay, so it's the whole package. The institutions, the traditions, the history.
And from this public political culture, Rawls says you can extract a political conception of justice. And this is a key concept for philosophers. It's freestanding. It doesn't come from any one religion or philosophy. It's drawn from those shared values, those core ideas that are already embedded in the fabric of the society.
Okay, so it's not just a compromise between different groups. It's something deeper than that.
It's something more fundamental. And that's what makes it legitimate, because everyone, despite their differences, can see it as fair. It's the bedrock, the solid ground on which we can build a just society.
And Rawls identifies three big ideas that he thinks are at the heart of any democratic public political culture. First, that citizens are free. Second, that they're equal. And third, that society itself is a fair system of cooperation between these free and equal citizens.
Right. Those are the non-negotiables. And any legitimate political conception of justice, it has to offer an interpretation of those core ideas.
So you're going to have different versions of liberal justice, but they'll all share certain family resemblances, right?
Exactly. They'll all protect basic rights and liberties. They'll give priority to those rights, making sure they can't be easily overridden. And they'll guarantee everyone the means to actually use those freedoms. Things like a decent standard of living, fair opportunities, access to health care.
Okay, so it's not just about freedom in the abstract. It's about making sure people can actually exercise that freedom in the real world.
And it's interesting to note that, by Rawls' definition, a purely libertarian system wouldn't count as a liberal political conception of justice.
Because it wouldn't necessarily ensure that everyone had those basic means.
Exactly. It might allow too much inequality, which could end up undermining those liberties for some people. Rawls was very much concerned with ensuring a basic level of fairness, a kind of social safety net. And that's where justice as fairness comes in. But before we get there, we need to talk about stability.
Right, because a system can be legitimate, based on fair principles. But if people aren't actually willing to follow the rules, then it all falls apart.
And that's where overlapping consensus comes in. It's Rawls's answer to the question of how you get a stable society, even with all these different worldviews floating around.
So it's not just about agreeing on the rules, it's about internalizing them, believing in them.
Yeah, it's about that deep underlying support. And in an overlapping consensus, people from different backgrounds, different comprehensive doctrines, they all come to endorse the same basic principles, but for different reasons. It's like this common meeting point where different paths converge.
The encyclopedia gives the example of the Second Vatican Council. The Catholic Church, based on its own theology, came to support the idea of religious freedom.
Right. And you can imagine other groups, Muslims, secular humanists, they might come to the same conclusion, but for their own reasons. They're all drawing on their own traditions, their own values, but they end up supporting the same basic principle.
So it's not just a compromise, it's a genuine convergence.
Exactly. And in this overlapping consensus, people come to see those core values like fairness, equality, liberty as really, really important. So important that they outweigh other values when it comes to making those big political decisions.
So they're not just going along with it, they're actually committed to those principles.
And that makes for a much more stable society. It's what Rawls calls stability for the right reasons. It's not just a temporary truce, it's a shared understanding, a shared commitment.
And while Rawls acknowledges that achieving this kind of consensus is not, a guaranteed thing, he does point to the historical development of many democracies as showing that this convergence is possible.
Yeah, it's not a utopia, it's an ongoing process. But there's hope, right? That over time, those divisions, those disagreements, they can soften. And that mutual trust, that sense of shared purpose can grow stronger.
Okay, so we've talked about legitimacy, about stability, and now we get to public reason. This is where Rawls takes the idea of reciprocity even further. It's not just about the rules themselves. It's about how we justify those rules, how we talk about politics in the public sphere.
It's about the kind of reasoning that's appropriate for a diverse democracy. It's about finding that common language, that shared set of values that everyone can understand, that everyone can engage with.
So when we're debating big political issues, we shouldn't just rely on our own personal beliefs, our own specific worldview.
Right. Because those might not resonate with everyone, right? Especially in a diverse society. Like, imagine a Supreme Court justice basing a ruling on a specific religious text. That wouldn't be an example of public reason, because not everyone shares that faith.
So you need to appeal to something broader, something more universal.
Exactly. And Rawls breaks down this doctrine of public reason into a few key elements. It applies to certain activities, when you're in public office, when you're voting on those big constitutional issues.
Okay, so it's not like every conversation has to be governed by public reason.
No, it's specifically about those core political decisions. And it involves this duty of civility. It's like a moral obligation to justify your views, especially on those big questions, using reasons that everyone can understand, that everyone can potentially accept.
And those reasons, they have to be based on public values and public standards.
Right. So public values, they're those core values that we've been talking about. Things like freedom, equality, fairness, the idea that society is a cooperative venture. And public standards, they're the rules of the game. Common sense, basic logic, those generally accepted facts, things that we can all agree on.
So you can't just appeal to your own personal revelation or some obscure philosophical theory.
Right. It has to be something that can be shared, that can be debated, that can be evaluated by everyone.
And Rawls is very clear that this is a moral duty, not a legal one. We're still free to express our views, even those based on our own comprehensive doctrines. But when it comes to justifying those big political decisions, we should strive to use this language of public reason.
And there's a really important proviso here. Rawls says it's okay to draw on your own personal beliefs, your own religious or philosophical views, as long as you can also show how they connect to those public values, to those shared standards.
So it's not about silencing people, it's about finding that common ground, that shared language that can help us bridge those divides.
Exactly. And it's a high bar, right? It's a challenge. But it's a challenge worth striving for, especially in a society as diverse as ours.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork. We've talked about legitimacy, about stability, about public reason. Now let's get to the main event, justice as fairness. This is Rawls' grand theory of what a just society should look like.
It's his vision of a society where those ideals of freedom and equality, they're not just abstract notions, they're baked into the very structure of the system.
So it's not just about having good laws, it's about having a just system.
Right, exactly. It's about making sure those basic institutions, the way we organize our political, economic, and social life, that they embody those core values of freedom and equality.
Yeah.
It's about creating a society where everyone has a fair shot, where everyone can live a life of dignity.
And it's a direct response to some of the shortcomings he saw in other theories, right? Like utilitarianism.
Yeah.
He felt like utilitarianism could lead to outcomes that were unfair to certain groups.
Yeah, Rawls was very concerned about that. Utilitarianism, it can sometimes lead to sacrificing the well-being of some for the supposed greater good of the many. And Rawls felt like that was fundamentally unjust. He wanted a system that protected everyone, that ensured everyone a basic level of fairness.
And justice is fairness. It's all about those relationships between citizens.
Right. Absolutely. Rawls's vision is of a society where people relate to each other as equals, where no one has an unfair advantage just because of, who they were born to or what talents they happen to have. It's about breaking down those hierarchies, those systems that privilege some over others.
So a real commitment to equality.
And a deep concern for the least advantaged. Rawls argued that a just society is one that pays special attention to the needs of those who are worst off. It's about making sure everyone has the opportunity to live a good life, a flourishing life.
Okay, so where does this all start? Where does justice as fairness begin?
It all starts with what Rawls calls the basic structure of society. This is the foundation, the framework on which everything else is built.
The basic structure. So what exactly does that include?
It's the big stuff. The Constitution, the legal system, the economic order, the family, those institutions that have the most impact on our lives, on our chances for a good life.
So it's not just about individual choices, it's about the system itself.
Exactly. Because these institutions, they distribute the benefits and the burdens of social life. They shape our opportunities, our aspirations, even our sense of self-worth. And because these rules are often backed up by force, by the threat of punishment, Rawls says we need a really strong justification for them.
Makes sense. If you're going to force people to follow certain rules, you better have a good reason for it.
And in developing his theory, Rawls starts with some simplifying assumptions. He assumes a society that's, reasonably well off, no extreme poverty, no major conflicts, and he focuses on a closed society, one that doesn't interact with other countries, so he can really isolate those principles of justice.
So it's like building a model, right?
Yeah.
You start with a simplified version to get the basic principles right.
Exactly. It's about laying the groundwork. And then later, you can start to add in those complexities, those real-world challenges.
And justice as fairness is based on two key ideas. The first is that social cooperation is both necessary and beneficial, like we need each other to thrive. And the second is that the distribution of those benefits and burdens, it has to be fair.
Yeah, those are the starting points. And from those, Rawls develops what he calls a negative thesis and a positive thesis.
Okay, so let's break those down. The negative thesis first. What's that all about?
The negative thesis, it's about those things we don't deserve credit for. Like, you don't deserve credit for being born into a wealthy family or for being born with certain talents.
Yeah, okay. Those are just like accidents of birth, right?
Sure.
Luck of the draw.
Exactly. And Rawls argued that those arbitrary factors, they shouldn't determine your share of the good stuff in life. Just because you were lucky enough to be born with certain advantages, it doesn't mean you're automatically entitled to more.
So it's about leveling the playing field, taking those arbitrary advantages out of the equation.
And that leads to the positive thesis, which is this idea of equality-based reciprocity.
Equality-based reciprocity. So it's not just about equality. It's about like a fair exchange of mutual benefit.
You got it. It's about recognizing that those unearned advantages, those talents, those resources, they should be seen as a common asset, something that can benefit everyone, especially those who were less lucky in the birth lottery.
Okay, so how do those ideas translate into actual principles?
Well, that's where Rawls lays out his famous 2 principles of justice as fairness. The first one, it's all about liberty. It says that everyone has an equal right to the most extensive basic liberties that are compatible with everyone else having those same liberties.
So classic liberal stuff, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all that.
Exactly, those fundamental rights that are essential for living a free life. And Rawls was very clear that those liberties, they come first. They can't be traded off for other things like economic efficiency or even the greater good.
They're non-negotiable.
Absolutely. And a key part of that first principle is the fair value of the political liberties. It's not just about having the right to vote. It's about making sure that right actually means something.
So everyone has an equal chance to influence the political process, regardless of their wealth or their social status.
Exactly. So things like campaign finance reform, making sure everyone has access to information, those become really important for making that first principle a reality.
Okay, so that's the first principle. What about the second one?
The second principle, it deals with social and economic inequalities, and it has two parts. First, there's the principle of fair equality of opportunity, and this one, it goes beyond just saying, okay, no discrimination. It means that people who have the same talents, the same willingness to work hard, they should have the same chances in life.
So it's not enough to just remove those legal barriers.
Yeah.
You have to actually level the playing field.
Right.